Alright, let's go ahead and get started. Put the phones away. Let me get y'all to go ahead and take out a sheet of paper and put your name on it. So as with the last time I did this is partly an attendance-taking exercise. So if the only thing that winds up written on your sheet of paper is your name, you should still turn it in, because then I'm going to mark you as present. But I am now going to ask you 2 questions, and you're going to number 1 and 2, and you're going to answer each question in a sentence. You're going to answer each question in a sentence, and then these are going to be marked as either present or check plus, depending upon your answers to these questions. And this will get folded into the attendance and participation portion of the grade. Question number 1. So name at the top of the paper. Number 1. There's no handout yet. There will be a handout in a minute. Number 1. In a sentence, tell me something about who one of the following people is. Jennifer Gratz, Barbara Gruder, or Abigail Fisher. You can choose. Identify one of those people in a sentence. Yep.
What were the options?
Jennifer Gratz, Barbara Gruder, or Abigail Fisher. If the names don't sound familiar, then probably not much you can do. Question number 2. In a sentence, tell me what the Supreme Court decided in the case involving one of those people. It can be the same person, or you can pick a different one of them if you want. Make sure you're telling me which one you're talking about, but I did pick one of those people, same one or a different one, and tell me what the Supreme Court decided in her case in a sentence, as best you can. Everybody good? All right, go ahead and pass those towards the front. Don't keep writing after I give you a handout. All right. Raise your hand if you think you knew something about one of the cases. Raise your hand if you did not know anything about any of the cases. All right, most of you did not raise a hand either way. Okay, so it's just one form of encouragement to be doing the reading in advance of class. I like to talk a lot. I'm happy to talk for 80 minutes. I think it is more educational if you all are talking with me, right? So that works better if you've read the materials in advance. Okay, so there's a bunch of things I want to talk about today potentially, but there's two main things I think I want us to focus on, at least to start. The first one is a school desegregation case, and the second one is an affirmative action case. And the two kinds of cases are related to each other because they raise similar issues under the 14th Amendment. And both of them are relatively recent cases, right? Cases from your lifetime. Seattle, Washington, is a racially diverse city. The racial makeup of the public school district in Seattle, Washington, at whatever time this was, I think this was the late 90s, was 43% white, 24% African American, 23% Asian American, and the remaining 10% was split between Latino and Native American. I couldn't find the breakdown between those two, but the combination of Latino and Native American was about 10%. The elected school board in Seattle, over a long history of trying to figure out what the best rules are for assigning people to different schools, right? At some point in the 90s, what they settled on, right? The policy changes at various points over history. At some point in the 90s, what they settled on was we've got multiple high schools. Some of the high schools have specific like concentrations or particularly good reputation in certain kinds of areas of the curriculum, right? So people should get some choice, that kind of thing. So we basically want people to be able to choose which high school that they go to. But there might be issues with more people, you got 1,000 seats in this school, but 2,000 people try to choose it, right? So we got to figure out what we're going to do. So the system that they adopted is that incoming high school students rank order. They fill out a form in which they rank order their preferred schools. And then we have a whole computer or whatever set up to try to give as many people as possible their first choices, or their first or second choice at least, but there's got to be some tiebreakers built into the system so we know how to decide. One of the tiebreakers, for example, is a sibling preference, right? If your sibling already attends that school, then you get a preference. Obviously that makes it easier on your parents, right? Delivering kids to the same school instead of two different schools. And one of the preferences was about race, right? One of the tiebreakers in the system was about race. It's a little convoluted the way it was written, but the gist of it was that if the existing racial makeup of this high school is significantly different from the racial makeup of the district as a whole, right? So the district as a whole, those figures I gave you, it's like 57% non-white, the district as a whole. But if this particular high school was like 80% non-white, right, so it's pretty different from the district as a whole, then you would get a tiebreaker in your preference if you attending that school would help bring it closer to the district-wide numbers. So a white student listing that school as her first choice would get a boost, right? Because that school is already 80% minority. The district as a whole is only 60% minority. So if we bring more white students in, that brings it closer. Conversely, if the school was 80% white, then a student of color would get a boost if that was her first choice for that school. That's the high school assignment policy in the public school district of Seattle in the late 1990s. Is that constitutional? What do you think?
I'd say it was.
How come?
It's offering equal opportunity to both races.
How so?
Because
Just
it's
like
not-
spell that out a little bit. Yeah.
Like, let's say it's the best school in the district, and you have most majority white population in it. It's trying to allow people the chance to get there, even if it's not typically the school they would go to. It would be like offering a chance for like one of the city schools around here to go to the high school I went to, which is 20 minutes down the road. I mean, I think that it would be a better opportunity for some people. I can't see how that would be a bad thing.
Other thoughts?
So, through the lens of like precedents that other similar decisions were made through, the affirmative action policy has to be narrowly construed, and I don't find this policy very narrow. In the majority opinion, they cite a hypothetical. What if a school is 50% minority, but the minority population is, close to 100% African American, and Asian Americans and Latino and Native Americans are left out of the equation. The majority opinion tends to criticize the lack of narrow construction around the policy, and I think that it makes sense if they're just lumping in minorities with, one group.
Let me put a couple of legal terms on the board just so we can make sure we know what we're talking about. Two of the things the judges wind up talking a lot about in these cases are what is the purpose of the policy, right? Does the government have a really good reason for this policy? And how good is the fit between the policy and the reason, right? So you might have a good reason, but you actually design a policy that doesn't really seem like it fits with that reason very well, right? So Jack's comment is maybe the details of this particular policy are not as well drawn as they could have been to promote the goal. The goal is promoting educational diversity in the city's high schools. Other thoughts? Daniel?
Well, he hit what I was really trying to say was the state does have an interest in desegregating its schools by some means, and while this is like a hard to see the policy here, the way it's hidden behind algorithm and computer or whatever, it still has the same basic purpose as busing or anything else, which is to help the schools have a better racial makeup.
And so, what's the conclusion?
My conclusion is that it would be constitutional.
Because
of the state interest and because it's I believe it would be narrow enough.
Other thoughts? I need to hear from more than 3 people, so I'm going to wait. Yeah.
Well, you're still denying or admitting someone based on whether they're white or a minority, so
And so,
it probably wouldn't be constitutional.
right. So it is true that for some students, right, the school that they wind up getting assigned to is determined in part by their race, right? The vast majority of students were getting their first or second choice, right? I think it was, I wrote this down, I think. It varied from year to year, but 80 to 90% of students typically got their first choice, so race doesn't affect them at all. And 89 to 97% of students got their first or second choice. So most students are getting one of their top choices. But if you're one of the 3% of students who got your third choice and that decision partly was based on your race, that is notable. Yeah.
But the way race is factored in, it doesn't just simply say, minority students go here and they will only get that. It's used as a tiebreaker.
Yep.
So it's not explicitly forcefully used. I think because it's used as a tiebreaker, it is constitutional.
And just spell that out a little more. Why is that significant?
because it doesn't just force, it doesn't, I mean, it doesn't make race the central deciding factor in deciding where you go to school. It takes in siblings, proximity, things like that, as well as your basic choices. It only kind of factors in like maybe 2 or 3 decisions down the line, I guess.
It is for sure true that race is not the predominant factor in school assignment decisions, right? The vast majority of students, the predominant factor is what did you list as your first choice, and that's where you wind up in school, and race has nothing to do with it. Race is a factor, but it's one factor among many others. Race?
I think it's just, I think justice would be served if this was applied. However, I think it's unconstitutional just by the words of the 14th Amendment. If a student, if they don't make the first criteria, you're depriving them of access to that school based on their race.
Yeah, although it's like tailored as a tiebreaker, if you're in a situation where the school that you want to go to is not like readily admitting your race and will admit somebody else's race, if you don't have a brother or sibling going there, then it is no longer a tiebreaker. It is the only reason why you would not be allowed access to that school. So sometimes it acts like a tiebreaker, but if it ever doesn't act like a tiebreaker, then there's grounds for it.
So for some individual persons, it might be a factor that proves really significant. It's a factor that decides whether she can go to this school or not. That is true. Other thoughts? If you could take, I don't know if this is a helpful way to think about it or not, but try it. If you could take, sometimes we talk about like the originalist approach to the Constitution and what is James Madison going to think about something that he never heard of before? It's kind of a weird question. All right, so I'm not going to go that far back, although we could do that too. But just go back to like Brown versus Board of Education. And if you take the lawyers and the judges who participated in producing the decision that we know as Brown versus Board of Education, what would they say, do you think, about this policy?
Yes.
They would like it.
They would
Yes.
like it.
Because
it segregates. It desegregates.
Yeah.
It's active in the compelling interest.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have any words.
Yeah, that's all right. That's a start.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it's actively considering integrating schools and I know you're saying Brown v. Board, but it feels more like Brown v. Board 2, where it's specific outlines of what you should do to make schools more racially segregated or desegregated.
Other thoughts about Brown? Yeah.
Brown was trying to desegregate the Deep South that was forcefully racially segregated, whereas this attempts to ameliorate some sort of discrepancy in the schools. Now, I'm not sure what the situation in Seattle is when they don't have this policy enacted, but they do say in the majority opinion that Seattle is not a place that was historically segregated, and so
it was not segregated by law,
right,
is what they mean there. They
right,
do have some history of some schools that were almost all
right,
white.
right, and I kind of expect that in any sort of major
Yeah.
city, especially because of socioeconomic factors. But it feels like there might have been a more compelling interest under Brown, so it's kind of hard to compare the lawyers' arguments.
It's hard to compare, for sure. The lawyers and judges who participated in Brown in 1954 did not have to answer a question about this policy because there was nothing like this policy that existed anyway, or had existed anywhere at the time, right? There was no such thing as a school district actively trying to integrate its schools, right? That had never happened yet, right? So we don't know is part of the answer, but we can try to think about, well, what is the constitutional principle that they were trying to establish in Brown and how would that principle apply to this different situation, right? So it's an exercise in like reasoning by analogy. Like we don't know exactly. We're trying to figure out what is the principle they were trying to establish and how would that apply here. And there's no one right answer to this question. There are a couple possibilities, and we've heard them both, right? It might be the case that the lawyers and judges who participated in Brown were trying to establish the principle that public schools should not be assigning students on the basis of race at all, period. That should be like an absolute rule. We got no business doing that. In which case, this policy looks like it's probably unconstitutional if we stick with that principle. Or it might be the case that they were trying to establish the principle that our public schools should be racially integrated, because that has all kinds of benefits for the education of everybody, and we think our public schools should be racially integrated. And the public schools in Topeka, Kansas in 1954 were not racially integrated, obviously, and so they were doing something unconstitutional, and that's the principle that's established in Brown. But here, the Seattle schools have adopted a policy that is attempting to better integrate, to like further and maintain the racial integration that they have. And so that does not violate the principle. So this policy would be constitutional. If you read the opinions in the case, both Chief Justice Roberts, who writes the majority opinion, the court strikes down the policy 5-4, both Chief Justice Roberts, who writes the majority opinion, and Justice Breyer, who writes like a 70-page dissenting opinion, right? Both of them talk in some detail about Brown versus Board of Education, and they draw opposite lessons from the case, right? And some of that's in the quotes, the admittedly lengthy quotes that are on your handout. So the first one's from Chief Justice Roberts, and he is saying, I'll try to break some of this down for you. So the parties are debating which side is more faithful to the heritage of Brown, but the position of the plaintiffs in Brown was spelled out in their brief and could not have been clearer. And then what he does here is he quotes from the NAACP's own brief in Brown. The 14th Amendment prevents states from according differential treatment to American children on the basis of their color or their race. Right? What do these classifications at issue here do if not accord differential treatment on the basis of race? And then he quotes Robert Carter, who was one of the NAACP's lawyers. Thurgood Marshall's the most famous one, but they had a whole team of lawyers working on the case. He quotes Robert Carter, who participated in the oral arguments, who said, "We have one fundamental contention, which we will seek to develop in the course of this argument. And that contention is that no state has any authority under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to use race as a factor in affording educational opportunities among its citizens." If that is the principle that Brown established, then this policy is unconstitutional, right? Because the state is using race as a factor in affording educational opportunities among its citizens. If I jump down to Breyer's quote, he talks about the long history and moral vision that the 14th Amendment embodies, the plurality, so he means Chief Justice Roberts' opinion there, cites in support those who argued in Brown against segregation, and Justice Thomas, who had a concurring opinion, so he's also referencing that. Justice Thomas likens the approach that I have taken to that of segregation's defenders. But segregation policies did not simply tell school children where they could and could not go to school based on the color of their skin. So there he's quoting directly from Roberts' opinion. They perpetuated a caste system rooted in the institutions of slavery and 80 years of legalized subordination. The lesson of history is not that efforts to continue racial segregation are constitutionally indistinguishable from efforts to achieve racial integration. Indeed, it's a cruel distortion of history to compare Topeka, Kansas in the 50s to Louisville and Seattle in the modern day. The court was deciding two different cases on this same day. The other one was from Louisville. To equate the plight of Linda Brown, who was ordered to attend a Jim Crow school, to the circumstances of Joshua McDonald, whose request to transfer to a school closer to home was initially declined. It was later approved. He eventually got the transfer to the school he wanted to go, but it was like a year later or something. Those are not the same thing, right? The treatment of some white students by the Seattle School District in the 1990s is not the same thing as the treatment of African American students by the Topeka School District in the 1950s, right? Breyer's like, these are two, they both have something to do with race. The state is considering the race of students in both of them, but they are not the same thing, and the Constitution doesn't have to treat them identically. Yeah.
I have a slight problem with like using Brown versus Board with this. Like obviously it was done. Wouldn't it be a better argument for them to use a case like Virginia where people were choosing schools to be applying to?
I mean, they do cite other cases too, right?
I feel like that has a clear resemblance to this,
Yeah.
as opposed to Brown versus Board.
So if you read Breyer's 70-page dissenting opinions, so there's a lot of stuff in there, right? A lot of it's devoted to like studying the providing like data about like what's happened with school integration over the like 50 years since Brown. You know how there's been a lot of resegregation in a lot of places, and he gets a lot of that data. But a lot of it is references to the court's various precedents. And so Breyer points out that there's a whole bunch of court decisions after Brown in which the courts, including the Supreme Court, like pushed for actual integration, right? Just saying, we don't treat anybody differently on the basis of race anymore is not good enough. The court demanded some actual progress towards integration. And that's now what Seattle's trying to do, right? So Breyer looks at those cases. I don't remember if Roberts looks at those cases or not. Roberts is trying to go back to the first one and say, here's where we all started on this task. Here's the principle we established. I agree with that principle, right? Roberts is not opposed to Brown versus Board of Education. I agree with that principle. I think we should stick to it. But that means school districts are not allowed to assign students on the basis of race, either to disadvantage members of a particular race or to advantage members of a particular race, if that's the right way to phrase it. So Brown is not it's not like a direct precedent where we decided the exact same thing we're trying to decide today, so it tells us what to do, but it's like a foundational, landmark case that they all want to try to say, what I'm saying today is consistent with Brown versus Board of Education. Everybody loves that one, so I'm trying to tie my arguments into that one if I can. Other thoughts about this one? All right, let's shift to affirmative action a little bit. So we talked a little bit about University of California versus Bakke last time. Let me show you this. So the court has decided several cases about affirmative action since then. The most notable of which are two cases about affirmative action at the University of Michigan, which the court decided in 2003. See how often I use this thing. Here we go. So the University of Michigan, like the Seattle School District, the University of Michigan has had lots of different admissions policies, right? It's changed them many times, right? And so if a lawsuit is filed, the court winds up looking at the policies at some particular point in time and trying to decide whether that was constitutional or not. At some point in the late 1990s, the undergraduate admissions policy at the University of Michigan for the Maine College of Liberal Arts basically worked like this. And remember, it's a giant university, way bigger than SU. There's thousands upon thousands upon thousands of applications every year that they have to process. They scored each application on a 150-point scale. 110 of those points were awarded based on high school GPA and SAT scores, right? So if you had perfect GPA and perfect SAT scores, you got 110 points, right? And there was some formula for combining less than perfect GPA and SAT scores to figure out how many of those points you get. up to 40 additional points were awarded on the basis of other factors. And if I can get this to turn on, I'll show you what those other factors look like. You could get it's coming up now. You could get a maximum of 40 points of these other factors, and you could get only a maximum of 20 from any one category. Right? So you can't get all of these things. Right? You can't get like 100 points on this stuff. You get a maximum of 40, a maximum of 20 from any one factor. Some of them were about geography, giving preferences to Michigan residents, given additional preferences to underrepresented parts of Michigan, given a small preference to folks. University of Michigan tries to say we got students from every state in the country, right? SU likes to say that too, so you got to give a little preference sometimes to applicants from Montana or whatever, because there aren't that many of them. Preferences if your family, members of your family went to University of Michigan. A tiny preference for an outstanding application essay. Why is that so small? I got no idea. Some small preferences for demonstration of outstanding personal achievement or like leadership and service. So like if you were a National Merit Scholar, like that's a national recognition of achievement, so you would get 5 points. If you got some statewide Michigan award, you'd get 1 point. Same for any like leadership and service roles. And then 20 points for demonstrated socioeconomic disadvantage. And remember, you can only get up to 20 in any one category, so you can't add these together. 20 points if you are an underrepresented racial or ethnic minority, right? So that means a member of a racial group that is currently underrepresented on Michigan's campus. 5 points if you were a male student applying to Michigan's nursing program, because they were trying to diversify that program on the basis of gender. 20 points if you were a recruited athlete, or 20 points awarded at the provost's discretion, which you can just imagine what that might, like who has the provost's phone number and can like get somebody's file on the provost's desk and get 20 points awarded. That's the policy that was used for just a couple of years at the University of Michigan. As they changed their policy multiple times, and this was a policy that was in place at one particular point in time. It's not currently in place. Is that constitutional? I see a couple head nods and shakes, and I'm going to call on somebody. But I'll wait for a second. Yep.
I think they said with the undergrad program, it was unconstitutional because it wasn't narrowly tailored enough.
That's right. So part of what we're trying to do here is just learn things that have actually happened, right? So what does the Supreme Court actually say? And the answer is yes, the Supreme Court strikes this policy down, right? They continue to uphold some affirmative action policies, but they struck this one down. So part of what we're doing is just understanding what has happened, right? And I'm going to say a little bit more about why I think that happened. Why did the court strike this one down, but they upheld some other ones? But part of what we're trying to do is also think through for ourselves, what do we think the Constitution means or should mean, and how do you apply it to different situations, right? So the answer is yes, this policy is currently unconstitutional in the sense that the Supreme Court struck it down. But that decision was 6-3, right? Not everybody agreed with it, right? There were lawyers and judges on the other side, so I want us to spend a little time thinking about what do we think of it.
Let me just ask a question of you. If you could clarify, how does the University of Michigan relate to the state in that it's a state actor or whatever
Yeah,
the case
so
is.
so it's a public university, so it's not like SU, it is like SUNY Binghamton or whatever, right? So it's a university that is part of the state government, right? So like the provost and the chancellor and all the faculty members and all the custodians and food service workers, they're all state employees, right? And so the 14th Amendment applies directly, right? So it gets a little confusing with public universities sometimes because it used to be that almost all of their budget came from state appropriations, and now states everywhere have like cut funding for higher education so much that that's why the university chancellors spend all their time like raising money, because like just like most of their funding comes from like private donations and tuition as well. So the state doesn't even pay for that much of what the university does, but they do still pay for some of it. And all the employees are public employees, and it is considered part of the state government. It is responsible to state governmental officials, right? There's an elected board of regents, and in Michigan, actually directly elected by the voters, which is a little weird. And they're ultimately in charge of every policy at the university. So this is a state policy. So the 14th Amendment clearly applies. That argument gets more complicated when you're talking about a private university. Maurice.
This is another case where Maurice thinks it's just, but the Constitution, like the Equal Protection Clause, is rather clear. And in the like miscellaneous, the 20 points for underrepresented racial as an advantage you're giving someone based on their race.
For sure.
And honestly, the men in nursing, a woman in nursing could probably use the Equal Protection Clause as well to say that a man is given an unfair advantage based on his gender.
There are some affirmative action cases focused on gender-based affirmative action too. Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of look at it the same way, like mentioning that, like for Brown, like the argument that the primary principle should be like you can't use race in any circumstance as a factor for reporting opportunities. It's kind of the same thing here, because yeah, like on its face, like it looks like it's good, it's trying to integrate more, but you're actively going to, I guess, like some people are going to lose the opportunity to be admitted, even that they may necessarily be more qualified, just because of the racial or even like the gender preference for like men in nursing kind of thing. So I think for that reason, like it is unconstitutional. You're losing. Some people are going to lose that opportunity.
Like with the Seattle school policy, in some individual cases, like 110 of the points are your GPA and your test scores, right? That is most of the factor for most students. But in some individual cases, are there some students whose admissions decision was influenced by race? The answer is yes.
Going off that point, like what he said about not, or like students not being admitted that might be more qualified, like they don't take into account, in my opinion, like a lot of things that matter. Like the essay is like basically nothing, which is surprising to me. And there's like personal achievements that I feel like matter a lot. And like if you add up those things, like they would get less points than like a scholarship athlete. And like I just feel like someone potentially could get denied under this circumstance who would be more qualified, or like even take schooling more seriously than like someone else who gets automatically 20 points if you're a scholarship athlete.
It's for sure jarring to see the difference between how much they were rewarding an outstanding essay and how much they were rewarding some other things. But so let me just ask, so like which items on this list do you think are constitutionally problematic?
A lot of the miscellaneous ones, I feel, because they're worth so much more than things that I think are important. Not necessarily that I don't think those are important, but I'm just saying, like, I feel like they're counted so much more than some of the other things.
Yeah.
I know, like, obviously the 14th Amendment has roots in, like, race. Obviously, that's like the point of it. And Brown v. Board is racial. But the actual clause is that any person should not be denied the equal protection of the laws. So if a category based on race is discriminatory and violating the equal protection clause, then how is legacy not violating the Equal Protection Clause? How is not choosing underrepresented people from the state? That's still, I mean, obviously it's not a racial discrimination, but it's still discrimination not based on merit. You're saying something that basically these people didn't decide is going to qualify them more to get into access to this education than their merits.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense too, because I think that's easier to defend when you look at how many points they're getting. Like when you're talking about 2 points for a state, I think it's just hard, and this was said before, it's hard to defend when you're talking about 20 points on it's out of 150.
Yeah.
So if you have someone who's, gets the full 110 points, but is white, and then someone who gets 130 because they're of a minority, that's a huge disparity. And I think that makes it, I don't think that changes the constitutionality, the numeric value assigned to it, but I think it's harder to defend when that's such a huge difference.
So let me just push back on that last point a little bit. So take the legacy, right? So it's a much smaller preference, but it might be significant in individual cases, right? Is there somebody, what is the cutoff in any given year? Is the cutoff at 110, and this bumped me from 108 to 112, right? And so is that constitutionally problematic? Not just whether part of what we're doing is we're seeing this policy and we're reacting to it. Like, what do we think? Do we think this is fair? If I was applying to the University of Michigan, is it fair or not? But connecting it to the Constitution, like, is there an issue with this?
I mean, I think so, but this is also my personal opinion. I think that's also very classist and elitist. That's, you're giving preference to someone whose parents went to college, and a lot of times minorities did not go to college. So
This is a good point. This one is a racial preference in the other direction, right? University of Michigan was legally segregated for a long time, right? There were no African American parents going there, for a long time. Like, how is that not the same thing? Like, if this one is unconstitutional, this one is smaller, that is true, but there are also some potential issues with that one. Yeah.
I just was interested, the way they wrote it, because they included, the highest point values in, miscellaneous. But if they were to carve out, they wanted to emphasize, the fact that they wanted to include underrepresented racial minorities in their education, put it under its own heading, geography would be.
Mm-hmm.
And while it's obviously worth more point-wise, they wrote it almost seemingly like they knew that it could come to an issue, and that someone could say it almost underscores that they're trying to make it less visible that they're trying to do this policy.
Mm-hmm. By hiding it in the miscellaneous category, is that?
I mean, they're not necessarily hiding it, but they're not stating as we are explicitly attempting to do this, and we want to bring attention to the efforts we're putting into representing racial minorities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Kind of going off that point and one of the other points that have been made, I'm curious, do you think it's a big framing issue in the sense that, if the scale of the points were smaller, maybe across the board, and maybe a word like miscellaneous wasn't used, and they actually try to say, okay, we're trying to gap, racial disparities or whatever, do you think constitutionality would have changed in a decision, or do you think it still would have, the 14th Amendment still would have contradicted it?
It might have changed, depending. Let me come back to that one. So if you read this opinion, so this is from Gratz versus Bollinger, if you read the opinion in full, the court actually winds up talking about several different versions of the policy because they kept changing it, right? And there was actually a few different people who filed suits, and so Jennifer Gratz had been rejected when one policy was in place, and this other guy, Patrick Hammaker, had been rejected when a slightly different policy was in place. And then both of those policies they had gotten rid of, and they had replaced it with this one. And part of the claim that Gratz and Hammaker were trying to persuade the court is not just that Michigan owes us something because they wrongly rejected us, but also we want to force them to change their policy. And so the court wound up talking about this policy. They wound up talking about 3 different versions. And now Michigan has a different version, which is still race conscious but doesn't look like this. So sometimes those details do make a difference, and I'll say more about that. Let me just focus us for one. So like a couple people have touched on how like, you know, 4 of these things down here are so much bigger than the other preferences. Like, you know, take scholarship athletes or take provost discretion, either one of those. Like, why do you think they set that at 20 points as compared to all these other smaller ones?
Because historically for minority students, one of the only ways we've been able to kind of like achieve higher education is through scholarships, like through, you know, sports and whatnot. Provost discretion, you know, sometimes just one administrator saying, hey, give this person a chance, has allowed us to enter higher education.
Okay, so in some sports, scholarship athletes are disproportionately people of color, right? And so there's some connections to race there. Provost discretion, I don't know what they were doing at University of Michigan. It's possible that some provosts could use this to try to boost minority applicants too, although actually that doesn't even really work because you could only get 20 points total from this category. So if you're already a racial minority, the provost can't do anything more to help you. In general, what this category usually means at most universities is like the kids of donors, right, or politically, you know, state legislators or whatever, call up the provost and say, my kid applied, can you do anything? And so that is something that universities sometimes do, which is of dubious legitimacy, right? But they sometimes do it. But why did they set it at 20 points? Like, why is that so much bigger than the other ones?
To like guarantee that they got in. Like if you offered someone from a school like a scholarship to play sports there, like even if their GPA and SATs weren't great, like you still want them to come play sports, so you'll add that.
That's right. I think guarantee might be a little strong. Like if I'm in the state legislature and my kid is like flunking out of high school and did terrible on the SATs, right? 20 points is still not going to get him in. But if he's like a mediocre student, right, and he did okay on the SATs, but not up to Michigan standards, 20 points is big enough to make a difference. Same with recruited athletes, right? If you flunked out of high school, you're not going to play football at Michigan, right? But if your grades were not great, they were below normal Michigan standards, is a 20-point boost. In general, over time, our experience has been that the 20-point boost is sufficient to get to what we're trying to get to, which is that we want these recruited athletes to be admitted, we want the provost to be able to get the state legislature's kids in, we want a reasonable number of underrepresented minorities on campus. And so that is why these ones are bigger, is because they have goals about the composition of the student body that they are trying to achieve, and they have set these numbers at the level that they think will get them to their goals. Do they have like an exact definite number, like every year we want 10 children of like millionaires who called us up? No, they probably don't have an exact definite number. But do they have some basic, you know, we want to be able to give these people a meaningful boost that will significantly impact their chances of admission.
I was just going to say, I think they're higher because they all interest the university more than the students.
What does that mean?
I think they were all created in interest of like the university's goals rather than the students, because if the university's, you know, goal to even out the student population or to be able to admit the students that they want to admit.
I got you.
And back to his point about how, you know, there's not just a category of socioeconomic status or minority status, because I was just going to say that it could only be awarded 20 points per category, and there was multiple things underneath one category that you could probably apply for all of them, but you could only get a maximum of 20. So that's probably why it's in that.
Right. I mean that in practice, that's why these things are all in the same category, is because the ones that are this big, we, for good reason, don't want somebody who's experienced socioeconomic disadvantage and is a racial minority and is a recruited athlete. We don't want to give him 60-point bonus, because that's going to mean somebody who failed out of high school is going to get in, right? Like, so that's why, in practice, that's why they're all in the same category, is to limit, is to say you can only get one of them.
I think ultimately, though, yes, the admissions criteria is, you know, there's a huge discrepancy in terms of the miscellaneous stuff. But we have to take into account the compelling state interest. Historically, minorities have been typically shut out of higher education. Like you said before, University of Michigan was segregated. That's been the case in a lot of states. In fact, most places were segregated out. In doing this, and in pursuing this policy, the university isn't so much trying to get like a specific number of minorities inside of its roster. It's attempting to not only open up those points of entry for education, but also trying to right that historical wrong of of segregation, of being shut out of education, of losing that opportunity. Now, does it necessarily take away points from a qualified student and give them to someone who's underqualified? Well, let's think about it. If we have student A and student B, student A is majority, student B is minority. They both have the 110 points maximum allowable by GPA stuff. Yes, student B will get that boost and by 20 points. But does that make that student any less capable of attending the university, any less capable of doing the work and rigors for it? No, we're giving that student kind of the benefit of that benefit that was not given to them before under previous administration.
A couple of important points here that I just want to flag for everyone. So one issue is about what are the justifications for affirmative action, right? And there are different kinds of justifications. Some of those justifications are kind of backward-looking, right? Well, we have a long history of racial discrimination, including by the University of Michigan itself, not just generic societal discrimination, but this university has discriminated against people on the basis of race, right? The Michigan system of public schools has not provided fair and equal education on the basis of race, right? There's school desegregation and school funding cases involving the Detroit schools, right? So there's that history, and so one of the justifications you sometimes hear for affirmative action is we're trying to compensate or make up for that history, right? By giving certain folks a boost. A different kind of justification for affirmative action is forward-looking, right? We believe, the people who are in charge of the University of Michigan, the educators, right, the people with the PhDs and everything who run universities, we believe that we will provide a better education to everybody at the University of Michigan if we do so in a racially diverse environment. Right? That is not about anything about who's been discriminated against in the past. That is right now, here, and looking forward. We think everybody who we are preparing to go off and work in a diverse world, be democratic citizens in a diverse world, everyone will benefit if they are educated in a diverse campus. And so the goal of this policy is to produce that diverse campus. Racial diversity is one part of that, but it is not the only part. Like, why do we care that we got students from every 50 states? Some of that is just because it looks good in the marketing materials, right? But, like, part of it is genuine, right? People from different regions of the country, right, bring different experiences to bear. And college is a place where people, for the first time, like, meet lots of people from somewhere other than themselves, somewhere other than where they're from, right? So we want people from all over. We want to give a preference to students from Montana and Wyoming, right? We are trying to bring diverse groups of people together. Achievements and leadership, it doesn't really sound like diversity, but there's a diversity component in that too, right? Somebody who's like an accomplished cellist, right? And somebody else who's like an accomplished singer, right? And somebody else who's an accomplished soccer player, right? That one's going to go down here, but like, we want to bring all those different kinds of people together, right? That is what we are trying to do in assembling our student body. And at a selective, this is not true for all universities, but at a selective university like the University of Michigan, we get like a zillion applications from people who are highly qualified, right? Perfectly capable of succeeding at University of Michigan, their own merits, their own whatever they've worked hard on, their own merits, like they deserve a chance at the University of Michigan, but there's too many of them, right? We get more of those folks than we could possibly admit. In fact, even if we admitted 0 people of color, which we used to do, right, we would reject lots of highly qualified white applicants. Right? Jennifer Gratz still would not have gotten in. Right? The University of Michigan's lawyers proved this in court. in the absence of this policy, she still had 0 chance of admission. There were too many white students with higher grades and test scores than her. Like, we admit no people of color. She still does not get in. Like, so it's a scarce governmental resource, right? There's not enough spots at the university. Thankfully, we got lots of good universities throughout the country, so that compensates for it in part. But there's not enough spots. And so we are trying to decide how to distribute them. And one way to think about that is, it should be purely merit-based. Whatever you come up with, like the objective criteria of merit, whatever those might be, and whoever's the highest, right? We're only admitting the, like, valedictorians from, like, every high school, right? A different way to think of it, which every selective university in the country says this different way is better, is merit's really important. We want lots of really good students, but we don't just want to admit all the valedictorians from every high school. We want to look at other stuff, and we want to try to bring a diverse group of people together. So that's what they're getting at here. Court says this one's unconstitutional. On the same day, the court decided a different case about Michigan's law school. Now, law school admissions is easier than undergraduate admissions at a giant university because there are not as many applications, right? It's not, you don't have to figure out what to do with like 20,000 applications. Michigan's law school had a policy that said there's no formulas, there's no points awarded, no numerical scores are assigned to any application. Every application is read in full and evaluated holistically by a certain number of admissions committee members. The biggest factors we are looking at is college GPA and strength of undergraduate institution and LSAT scores, right? But other kinds of diversity relevant factors, including race, we are also including in the mix. And so we don't have a point value. We don't have a sheet of paper like this that we can show you, right? But are we trying to admit people with a variety of different undergraduate majors? Yes. Are we trying to admit people from a variety of different states in the union and a variety of different countries? Yes. Are we trying to admit people from a variety of different races? Yes. We are intentionally trying to do all those things, but it's not quantified. It's just part of a holistic evaluation of each application. Supreme Court upholds that one on the same day.
So, do they prefer that that way of admitting affirmative action to their policy over this like very explicit way of implementing affirmative action because the explicit ways end up getting struck down?
Does who prefer?
The schools, because it seems like holistic. Yes, it does consider all of these other factors, but it's not like this system wasn't considering other factors. I mean, there was a point system developed for the merit and, extracurricular-based activities of students. So I guess this is also a holistic approach, but the holistic approach, as you were just mentioning, as colleges use now, it's more kind of under a veil, the holistic approach as in we consider all of these things and we are not willing to put a specific number or point system on any, value that we give, a certain extracurricular or geography or race or any other classification.
I just want to say that, what he's saying is absolutely right, and kind of goes back to what you said last class, where it seems like they've removed that discriminatory text, but you still have the effect, the discriminatory effect, and the discriminatory purpose. But without the text, the court doesn't seem to mind it so much.
So that might be right, although I'm not totally sure that discriminatory purpose is an accurate characterization.
The opposite direction.
Right? Yeah. I mean, colleges would say it's an anti-discriminatory purpose is what we have, which is disputable, but that's what they would say.
Was this somewhat like a discretionary argument?
Tell me what you mean.
Like with this one, like you either hit the point scale to get admitted or you didn't, and then the
Right.
law school, like it wasn't explicitly stated, but it was more like we'll consider this, and then like a committee makes a choice.
Yeah, basically. So there's three ways to think about this, right? So the university's lawyers, and and some of the justices on the Supreme Court say, this is not exactly how the university's lawyers would put it, but whatever. Some of the justices on the Supreme Court, for sure, would put it roughly like this. Both policies consider race. They work in different ways. The mechanics are different because undergraduate admissions at a giant university and law school admissions at a highly selective law school just are different, right? The scale is really different. They work differently, right? But they both consider race. In both instances, for some applicants, their decision of whether they get in or not get in is influenced in part by their race, and that is okay. Right? From the university's perspective and from the perspective of some justices, that is okay because it is for a non-discriminatory purpose. We are not trying to subjugate white people in the state of Michigan into an inferior caste in society. That is clearly not what is happening here. Right? It is a non-discriminatory purpose, and the purpose that it serves is educational diversity, which we think is very important. Right? The university people say it's really important, and they persuaded us. We think that's a compelling governmental interest. That's one way to think about it. A different way to think about it, the lawyers for Jennifer Gratz and Barbara Gruder, so Barbara Gruder's a white applicant who did not get into the law school, the lawyers for Jennifer Gratz and Barbara Gruder and some of the justices on the Supreme Court say both policies are basically the same, right? The mechanics are different, right? But both policies are race conscious. In both instances, the decision with regard to some applicants is significantly influenced by their race, and that violates the 14th Amendment. No state shall deny to any person the equal protection of the laws. That violates it. Whether you put a number on it or it's just subtle discretion. Either way, it violates the 14th Amendment. That's what Jennifer Gratz and Barbara Gruder's lawyers say. That's what some of the justices on the Supreme Court say. And there is a third way to think about it, which is in the middle, which is what the Supreme Court as a whole winds up doing, because Justice O'Connor and Justice Breyer say the two policies are different. This one is unconstitutional. The law school one is okay. Right? They are both race conscious. They both are designed to achieve the same purpose, educational diversity, but the mechanics of them are very different, and that difference matters. It matters because of this, right? The goal that the policies are serving is the goal of educational diversity, and so we agree that that's a compelling goal, right? But the constitutionality of the policies also depends on how carefully designed the policy is, right? We don't want to allow, under the Constitution, the consideration of race any more than is necessary, right? And so if the policy is carefully designed, narrowly tailored, to allow some consideration of race in order to serve this compelling goal of educational diversity, we think it's okay. If the policy automatically awards a large number of points to applicants simply on the basis of their race, we think that's not okay. Again, there's lawyers and judges on both sides who think that distinction makes no sense. Right? The policies are the same. They're both race conscious. Either that's allowed or it's not allowed. Right? But there's judges in the middle who are they're trying to draw this distinction. And one of the reasons they're trying to draw this distinction, right? And there are other areas where the court has done stuff like this too. We're going to see it on abortion rights, where the court reaffirms Roe versus Wade, but allows all kinds of restrictions on abortion, right? They're kind of trying to split the difference on a polarized issue. And one of the reasons why the justices would try to do that is because they think there's very important interests on both sides, right? And they are not comfortable with a decision that goes all the way in one direction or all the way in the other. One of the things that was notable about the Michigan cases, which at the time, I know you can't remember this, it's 2003, but I remember it very clearly, really closely watched Supreme Court decisions, lots of attention on them. major national media attention. Every university in the country is paying really close attention to it. All the lawyers for universities throughout the country are signing on to different briefs, trying to weigh in, like, well, here's how we do it at our campus, and we really think whatever the court decides, you should make sure you allow us some room to do it like this. And lots of groups, other than universities, filed briefs in the case, too. There was a widely noted brief that was filed by a bunch of, like a long list of retired, high-ranking military officers, like 4-star generals and admirals and the like, right? A bunch of retired military officers. So not the U.S. military itself, right? They're not getting sucked into the conflict, but retired military leaders, including like a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs and I think a former defense secretary, right? Whole bunch of retired, very prominent leaders of the U.S. Armed Forces file a brief urging the Supreme Court to uphold affirmative action at the University of Michigan. Why would they do that?
Affirmative action is a huge part of the military's desire to get diversity within its ranks.
Why does the military want diversity?
Well, I mean, I think there's an argument that it makes you stronger, but the counter to that is without diversity, it would just only be your highest socioeconomic, highest test takers.
So first of all, if we only had white soldiers, we would not have enough soldiers. There's that issue. But they particularly want diversity in the officer corps, right? This is a huge issue. This had in the past been a huge issue in the U.S. Armed Forces, right? During the war in Vietnam, there were repeated instances of racially motivated conflict between white officers and people of color grunts, right? Repeated, including some instances of violence, right, where racist white officers were, like, murdered or vice versa, right, by black soldiers, right? Repeated instances of racialized conflict in the Army because there were hardly any officers of color, in part. That's the impression. And so since Vietnam, U.S. Army and the rest of the military has made a concerted effort to recruit a diverse officer corps. Where do military officers come from? Most of them come from one of two places. They come from the service academies, right? You graduate from the Naval Academy in Annapolis or from West Point. You become an officer. All of the service academies use affirmative action in admissions in order to recruit a diverse student body. They also come from ROTC programs on college campuses, all of which use affirmative action in admissions to admit their student body, right? If there are not very many students of color at the University of Michigan, then there's not going to be very many students of color in Michigan's ROTC program, right? If there's no affirmative action at West Point, there's not going to be as many graduates of color from West Point. And so the military officers, the retired, the current military officers aren't allowed to like file an argument like this, but the retired ones can do whatever they want, right? The retired ones are like, look, this is an interest of national security, right? We need a diverse officer corps, and this is where we get it from. That is convincing the justices that this is a compelling interest here. It's not just like the liberal fancy universities or whatever, it's them, but it's like U.S. military, right? Usually thought of as maybe like a conservative institution in society, but they're weighing in really strongly. There's also a widely noted brief that's filed by a long list of Fortune 500 companies. It started with some companies based in Michigan, right? Like auto companies, for example, General Motors. Their lawyers were talking about the cases, and like we recruit a lot of our employees, right, from University of Michigan graduates, right? We're trying to like sell cars in a diverse world to all different kinds of folks. We need marketing staff who are themselves diverse and or who at least are comfortable with diversity because they have been around people unlike themselves. And so we think it's crucial for our economic success to have colleges, prestigious, selective colleges, graduating diverse sets of graduates. And so that one was influential too and got a lot of attention. When I say they were influential, got a lot of attention, these briefs got a lot of media attention, right? There was lots of people writing about them, and they appeared to get a lot of attention from the justices themselves. During the oral arguments, the justices asked questions that were drawn from these briefs. Well, what about that military brief? What do you guys think about that? Like, the lawyers are up there arguing the cases, lawyers for Jennifer Gratz and the lawyers for University of Michigan, and Justice O'Connor's like, yeah, what about that brief from the military officers? What do you think of that argument? So we know that they read them, we know that they were thinking about them, and then in their opinions, in Justice O'Connor's opinion in the Grutter case, she cited some of these briefs. So we know they played a role. And so that is like, all of those arguments are mostly about just convincing the court how important the government interest in educational diversity is. And they convinced 5 justices of that, right? And so then those justices are like, all right, this seems so important that we have to figure out some way to make these policies work under the Constitution. We are concerned about some versions of these policies. We think they look too blatantly like racial discrimination among different groups of Michigan applicants. So we're striking down the undergrad policy. But we think as long as the university is nuanced about it and gives every application full consideration, right? Nobody's application to the law school is like automatically rejected on some kind of formula or point system. Every application is getting read. There's way too many highly qualified applicants. We can't admit everyone. But we're reading every application in full. And race is one factor we consider. Supreme Court says that's okay. That is basically a reaffirmation of what the Supreme Court said in 1978. Remember, in the Bakke case, Justice Powell said, Alan Bakke wins. He's a white guy who applied to medical school at UC Davis. He wins. University of California, Davis cannot set aside a certain number of seats just for applicants of color, which is what they had been doing. They can't do that anymore. Alan Bakke wins. We strike down that policy. However, we take note of the fact that some universities have existing race-conscious policies that are more flexible. And we think those ones are constitutionally okay. That is what Powell said in 1978. There's lots and lots and lots of argument over that for like 25 years, and O'Connor basically says the same thing in the Michigan cases. Right? If the policies are not identical, right? The Michigan policies and California policies are not the same, but basically they say the same thing. Right? If it's too strict, formulaic, automatic consideration of race, then we strike it down. But if it's flexible, if it's one factor among many, serving a compelling interest in educational diversity, then it's constitutionally allowed under the 14th Amendment. This court, since the Michigan cases, the court has heard a couple cases from the University of Texas. The Michigan cases are the really important ones. The Michigan ones are the ones where the court like definitively sort of decides the issue, and the Texas cases pretty much just kind of follow along from the Michigan cases, with the caveat that the policy change in Texas gets super complicated, right? There's repeated changes to admissions policies in Texas that force repeated new lawsuits that lead the court to repeatedly like weigh in again. And some of these changes are super interesting. I'll say just kind of one part about them, just because it's kind of interesting. But the thing that's most important for the constitutional purposes is what the court says in the Michigan cases. In Texas, in 1996, before the Michigan cases, a lower court struck down Texas's affirmative action policies and said you can't consider race at all. Right, so this is like in between Bakke and the Michigan cases. Supreme Court hasn't weighed in again. Lower court's like, I know what they said in Bakke, but they seem to be moving away from that. Like they struck down some of these contracting policies in Richmond and elsewhere. And we think the current understanding of the law is that you can't use race at all. And so race-conscious affirmative action disappeared in Texas. And the state legislature in Texas said, we still want to make sure we maintain some diversity at UT Austin, which is the flagship public university. Texas is a very diverse state. We don't want an all-white flagship university. They say we can't use race, so we got another idea. We're going to come up with something that we're going to use. And the state legislature passed a policy called the Top 10% Law that said if you graduate in the top 10% of your high school, any high school in the state of Texas, you are automatically admitted to UT Austin. Doesn't matter what your SAT scores are. Doesn't matter what your essay or your extracurriculars are. If you're in the 11th or 12%, those things matter, right? Because you're still trying to get in. But if you're in the top 10% of your high school, you're automatically admitted. High schools in Texas are quite segregated. There's lots of all Latino and all African American high schools. And so everybody in the top 10% from those schools is Latino or African American. And so those folks automatically get admitted. And the policy basically worked pretty well. There was some complications. But it worked pretty well to maintain racial diversity at UT Austin in a completely race-neutral way, right? At least on the surface. Like nobody's race is being considered by the university. We don't even have to ask. We're just saying, are you in the top 10% of your graduating class? Then you're automatically admitted. Applies equally regardless of your race. And so some people pointed to it as evidence of a way that universities could maintain racial diversity without considering race. But most other universities outside of Texas looked into it and figured out that it wouldn't work, right? The University of Michigan has a more national applicant pool than Texas does. Almost everybody at UT Austin is from Texas, right? You can't admit the top X% of like people from every high school in the country. That's not going to work, right? You know, so it didn't seem like it was really translatable. In Texas itself, after the Michigan cases, right? So there's a lower court case in '96 that says Texas can't consider race. So the legislature adopts the 10% policy, which is working pretty well. It was working okay. 2003, the Supreme Court says universities are allowed to consider race after all. Right? And so then in Texas, they're like, oh, what do we do now? Do we stick with the 10% policy, which some people really like? Some of those, like, rural, poor high schools in Texas, they were nobody ever got into UT Austin from those schools in the past. And now every year, their top 10% of their graduates gets in. They're like, this is an awesome new policy. This is a form of socioeconomic diversity that we want to maintain. And some people were like, yeah, but it still is not giving us quite the same amount of racial diversity that we had before. We need to give more flexibility back to the university to try to assemble the student body. So they kept the 10% policy, and they said, but now that the Supreme Court said it's okay, the university can also do some flexible consideration of race on top of that if they want to. And Abigail Fisher challenged that policy and made her way to the Supreme Court, and she lost. Supreme Court was like, nope, I know they got a policy that's working pretty well, but we said in the Michigan cases, some consideration of race is still allowed as long as it's careful and flexible and not automatic. And they reiterated that in Abigail Fisher's case. And we are out of time, but happy to answer a question. You got one?
Sure.
Yeah.
Did they mention